Imagine you're living in a world where the air itself feels cursed, where every cough could mean death. And the streets are lined not just with the sick, but with the desperate. The year is 1348. The Black Death has swept through Europe like an unstoppable fire, devouring towns and cities, leaving behind silence and the stench of decay. But there's another story buried in that chaos, one that history rarely tells you. What happened to the criminals when the world itself had turned into a prison? See, when the plague hit, the rules didn't just bend, they broke. Jails overflowed, guards fled, and justice itself collapsed under the weight of fear. In many places, the line between the guilty and the innocent vanished completely. People who once stood trial for theft or murder suddenly found themselves face to face with something far worse than a hanging rope. They faced a society on the brink of madness. In medieval cities like Florence and London, prisons were death traps. Small, filthy, and overcrowded, they became breeding grounds for the plague. Imagine being locked inside, surrounded by rats, with the smell of rot in every breath. Guards refused to go near them. Priests stopped offering last rites. The authorities soon realized something grim: keeping criminals alive was more dangerous than letting them go. So, in many towns, they did exactly that. Entire prisons were opened, doors thrown wide. The sick and the damned were turned loose, not out of mercy, but out of fear. The logic was simple: better they die outside than spread death within. But what happens when you unleash a city's worst criminals into a dying world? That's where things get truly dark. Released convicts turned into scavengers, preying on the weak and robbing the dead. They stripped corpses of valuables, looted abandoned homes, and ambushed plague wagons, the grim carts that carried the dead to mass graves. Some criminals posed as plague doctors, pretending to bless homes while stealing everything inside. And because no one dared come near a plague house, they often got away with it. But there were also those who flipped the script: prisoners who used the plague as a chance for redemption. Records tell of men sentenced to die who instead volunteered to bury the infected or clean plague houses, believing it might buy them forgiveness from God or the crown. Most of them didn't survive long, but their names, though mostly forgotten, were whispered in chronicles as the condemned who served. Still, fear had its own kind of justice. Towns began creating plague laws, desperate, cruel measures to control chaos. Some cities decreed that anyone caught looting, no matter how small the theft, would be executed on sight. Soldiers patrolled with masks and torches, burning down homes of suspected thieves. Even priests turned informants, accusing the poor of spreading the pestilence through sin. And in the most shocking twist, some criminals found themselves hired by city councils. Yes, you heard that right. They were paid to do the work no one else would, hauling bodies, clearing houses, burning the infected. These corpse handlers were feared and hated, treated as untouchable outcasts. People called them searchers or watchmen of death. They lived apart, wore marked cloaks, and were forbidden to touch anyone outside their trade. But survival had a price. Many of these plague workers used their role as a cover to rob the dead. With no witnesses, who could stop them? Others were accused of spreading the plague deliberately, smearing infected blood on doors or poisoning wells, rumors born from fear, but deadly all the same. Dozens were executed based on nothing more than whispers. And here's the haunting truth: in those years, justice and death walked hand in hand. No one could tell where punishment ended and disease began. As cities tried to cling to order, kings and councils faced a grim dilemma. How do you maintain law when half your enforcers are dead? Some rulers, like Edward III of England, tried to restore order by issuing brutal decrees. In 1349, he ordered that thieves caught stealing from plague victims be drawn and hanged without trial. But even that failed to stop the madness, because deep down, everyone, the noble, the priest, the beggar, the criminal, knew the same truth: the plague didn't care who you were. And that's when the executions began to turn symbolic. Instead of serving justice, they served fear: public displays meant to convince people that order still existed. But the reality, it was already gone. Let's go deeper into the chaos. Because the plague didn't just kill people, it killed the meaning of punishment itself. When half the population vanishes in a matter of months, what does crime even mean? What's the point of jailing a thief when the jailer himself is dying? In many places, local lords took justice into their own hands. The courts stopped meeting, trials vanished, and so justice became personal. If you caught someone stealing from your home, you didn't call for guards, you became the executioner. Imagine the scene: a man caught dragging a loaf of bread from a plague victim's house. A crowd gathers, starved, angry, terrified. No trial, no judge, just ropes, fire, and desperation. In Paris, Reports told of mobs hanging suspected thieves from trees along the Seine, their corpses left to rot as a warning. In Italy, the plague gang's former prisoners turned raiders were hunted by vigilantes who burned them alive in the streets. It wasn't about justice anymore. It was about survival, about control, about finding anyone to blame. And it wasn't just thieves who paid the price. Entire groups were accused of spreading the plague. Beggars, foreigners, lepers, and even religious minorities became convenient scapegoats. Torture returned with full force. People were stretched, broken, and burned not for what they'd done, but for what people feared they might have done. One chilling example comes from Switzerland in 1349. Dozens of people were executed after being accused of poisoning wells. There was no proof, only paranoia. Entire communities wiped out because fear demanded blood. Meanwhile, the criminals who escaped the cities often found a strange kind of freedom in the wilderness. Bandit kingdoms rose in the ruins, groups of outlaws hiding in forests and mountains, raiding caravans and carving their own twisted order from chaos. Some even declared themselves lords of plague lands, ruling over the dying countryside. And if you think this sounds like medieval fiction, think again. Chroniclers from the time wrote about gangs of plague survivors who refused to return to normal life even after the disease passed. They'd grown used to the lawless world, a world where death ruled and fear was power. But in the middle of all that horror, there were rare glimmers of humanity. A few judges and priests tried to hold real trials again, sometimes even offering mercy. In Milan, records show that some prisoners were pardoned for helping bury plague victims. In London, a few were given bread and release in the name of charity. Still, most weren't that lucky. The truth is, when plague ruled, the system broke beyond repair. The law became whatever the living said it was, and for the criminals, it meant a fate even worse than the noose. Because in those years, being a criminal didn't mean breaking laws. It meant being expendable, and when you were expendable in the Middle Ages, your story didn't end with death. It ended with forgetting. When the plague tightened its grip across Europe, chaos became the new order. The courts were silent, prisons were overflowing with the dying, and no one dared touch the infected, whether they were saints or sinners. But with every passing week, fear transformed into fury. People were desperate to see justice again, even if it meant inventing it. In England, when city watchmen refused to approach prisons, nobles and local lords began ordering plague purges. Entire cells were cleared by torchlight. Those accused of theft, assault, or even gossiping about the nobility were dragged into the streets and executed on the spot. There were no judges, no juries, only fear wearing the mask of authority. One chronicler described it like this: men were hanged not for their crimes, but for the sickness that followed them. But here's the twist: some criminals didn't just survive the plague years, they thrived. As death emptied cities, power shifted into the hands of those who dared to take it. Bandit groups roamed from town to town, stealing from abandoned estates, raiding carts of medicine, and even intercepting plague doctors. Some wore the plague doctors' beaked masks themselves, claiming to bless homes while robbing them blind. And in a world where everyone was too afraid to come close, no one could stop them. These gangs grew so powerful that in certain parts of France and Germany, local lords had to negotiate with them, offering money, food, or even pardons in exchange for peace. They became lords of fear, walking freely through villages that would never dare to question them. But survival had a dark irony, because while they escaped the ropes of justice, they couldn't escape the invisible noose, the plague itself. Many of these criminals believed their cunning could outsmart death. They wore herbs under their clothes, coated themselves in garlic and vinegar, or burned the homes of plague victims thinking the smoke would protect them. Yet, time after time, they fell like the rest. Their bodies were dumped into pits with the very people they had robbed. Still, their legacy of terror outlived them. Stories of plague bandits haunted Europe for decades, men who supposedly returned from the dead, spreading disease and revenge in equal measure. But even those who avoided infection weren't safe, because the world that came after the plague wanted someone to blame. When the worst of the Black Death faded, those in power, kings, clergy, and city officials began looking for scapegoats to explain why so many had died and why order had fallen apart. Guess who made the easiest targets? The very criminals they had once released. Royal decrees called for the cleansing of the wicked. Former prisoners were rounded up, branded with hot irons, or forced into public punishments to prove the sins of man had brought the plague. The justice system, newly revived, needed victims to reassert its power. And that's where medieval imagination took a horrifying turn. Public punishments became theatrical. Ritualized events meant to restore the illusion of divine control. A thief might not just be hanged, he'd be displayed in a cage, left for days as crows pecked his flesh. A murderer could be tied to a cart and dragged through the city streets before being burned alive. The flame seen as a purification, but for lesser crimes, lying, blasphemy, cheating, or even suspicion of plague, spreading the punishments, grew stranger and crueler. One of the most feared was the pillory. Imagine being locked into a wooden frame in the town square, your head and hands trapped, while crowds threw rotten food, stones, and filth at you. It wasn't just pain, it was humiliation. People spat on you, taunted you, and sometimes beat you to death while guards looked on. And then there was the cucking stool, for women accused of gossip or spreading evil airs. Believed to carry plague, this was their sentence. They were strapped to a chair and dunked repeatedly into rivers or cesspools. The filthier the water, the better. It was meant to wash away sin, but more often it drowned the victim. In Germany, public shaming went a step further. Mask punishments became a twisted trend. Offenders were forced to wear iron masks, shaped like pigs, donkeys, or demons, symbolizing their crimes. Imagine being made to wear a grotesque metal face, horns welded to your head, while children laughed and adults cursed your name. These acts weren't about justice anymore, they were about fear made visible. The plague had taught people that death could come at any moment, so they needed someone to see punished, someone to remind them that they still had control, and that's when the church stepped in. You might think religion would bring mercy, but during the plague years, the church's grip grew darker. Priests declared that the plague was divine punishment, a cleansing of humanity's sins. Criminals were often paraded into cathedrals before their execution, forced to confess before crowds while being whipped by monks chanting hymns of repentance. If you were lucky, the confession bought you a merciful death, hanging, or beheading. But if the crime was deemed mortal sin, theft from a church, blasphemy, or heresy, you were handed over to the flames, and the people cheered, because in their minds the burning of one sinner could cleanse the city of its disease. Yet behind those flames was a truth most refused to see. The church itself was afraid. Priests, bishops, even popes died in droves during the plague, their authority collapsing like everything else. Public punishments weren't just justice, they were distraction. A performance to remind the survivors that the church still held God's favor, even when their prayers had gone unanswered. The few who questioned it, who said maybe the plague wasn't punishment, maybe it was just nature, were branded as heretics. Many were tortured in dungeons beneath monasteries, their screams echoing beneath the stone halls that once promised salvation. It's easy looking back now to think of the Middle Ages as a distant nightmare, but when you read the accounts, the first-hand writings of survivors, the fear feels alive. A monk in Avignon wrote, "Men forgot kindness, mothers shunned their sons, brothers turned against each other, and justice was a beast feeding on the dying." And that, right there, captures it. The plague didn't just destroy lives, it destroyed trust. It shattered the foundation of law, faith, and humanity itself. But in the cracks it left behind, something else began to grow. Whispers of rebellion, a hunger for truth, and the beginning of something that would change Europe forever. Because out of the ashes of the plague years, the people would rise angry, traumatized and unwilling to ever let the old system control them again. But before that change could come, justice would have to get much darker. By the time the plague's shadow began to fade, Europe was a place unrecognizable, not because it had healed, but because it had hardened. What survived wasn't mercy or wisdom, it was vengeance. And in that new, bitter world, justice became a word soaked in blood. When the dust of death settled, kings and city lords faced a new problem. Power was slipping through their fingers. The old structures of control, the courts, the laws, the priests, all had been weakened by chaos. People had seen that death didn't care for titles or crowns. So, how did rulers regain obedience? By making examples, and nowhere was that more obvious than in the way criminals were treated after the plague years. Punishment wasn't just about crime anymore, it was theater, public spectacle, a performance of control for a frightened audience that needed to believe the world had order again. Take 14th century London, for instance. In the years following the plague, the city introduced something new: justice parades. Condemned prisoners were forced to walk through the streets in chains, carrying the tools of their crime. A thief would drag a stolen basket. A liar might carry a painted tongue. A murderer sometimes was forced to carry the very weapon he'd used before it was used on him. The crowds roared. Children threw stones. Women shouted curses from their windows. For the survivors, these gruesome rituals were catharsis, a way to feel powerful again in a world that had stripped them of control. But for the condemned, It was psychological torture before the real horror began. One execution record from 1361 describes a man accused of robbing the sick, taking coins from the dying during the plague. His sentence? To be dragged through the city, beaten with rods dipped in pitch, then hanged from the gates, as warning to those who would rob the hand of death. But justice wasn't the same everywhere. Across Europe, each region added its own twisted creativity. In Italy, city-states like Florence and Venice turned punishment into art. Torture devices became more elaborate: wheels, racks, boots that crushed bones. The famous scavenger's daughter, a steel frame that folded the body inward until bones snapped, was designed not just to kill, but to display pain. The tortured were placed in public squares as divine reminders of consequence. In Germany, the infamous Iron Maiden appeared not as the popular myth of the spiked coffin suggests, but as a psychological punishment. Victims were placed in a narrow metal cabinet, their movements restricted, and left in total darkness for days. Some died of suffocation, others of madness. But the real horror wasn't always in the pain, it was in the shame. For medieval people, reputation was everything. To be labeled a sinner or a criminal meant social death, exile, ruin, and humiliation for your family. Public punishment capitalized on that fear. One of the most disturbing examples came from the Low Countries, where cage punishments were common. Criminals, especially thieves, heretics, and plague-era deserters, were locked in hanging cages, suspended above city gates. Their corpses were left there to rot, bones clattering in the wind for months. It wasn't just to punish the dead, it was to terrify the living. Travelers described cities where these cages lined the roads like grim signposts. A warning: this is what happens when you break the law, or worse, when you challenge power. But here's the thing most people don't realize. Not everyone in those cages was guilty. The fear that followed the plague made paranoia rampant. Superstition was law. If a village suffered illness, famine, or fire, people demanded someone to blame. And so the accused multiplied not by proof, but by rumor. A widow who refused a marriage proposal. Witch, a beggar seen coughing near a market. Plague spreader, a traveler carrying herbs and vials. Sorcerer or poisoner. In Switzerland, entire families were executed for allegedly summoning the pestilence. In one case, 3 brothers were boiled alive because they were caught washing coins, which townsfolk believed was a ritual to spread disease. That's what medieval justice became. A mirror of fear. The less people understood, the more violently they punished. And yet, as brutal as it was, there were glimmers of something shifting beneath the surface. Some began to question whether all this cruelty really served God's will. A handful of scholars and monks started writing against the excesses of torture. One anonymous monk in 1375 wrote, "If justice is blind, then in our time she gropes not for truth, but for blood." But voices like his were few and dangerous, because by now the church and state had found a terrifyingly effective partnership. The plague had weakened faith, so they rebuilt it with fear. Heresy trials, inquisitions, and witch hunts became the new form of justice. One of the most infamous cases came decades later, inspired by this very era. A young woman named Margarita in 1384, accused of using charms to cleanse the air. She was a healer, one of many who used herbs and smoke to purify plague houses. But when people died anyway, she became the scapegoat. Her trial was public, her confession forced under torture, and her execution was described as cleansing the pestilence from the city. Her death was celebrated as divine victory, but privately, some citizens began whispering, "How many more must die to prove we are righteous?" It was a question that spread slowly, dangerously, like a spark in dry straw. Still, for most people, fear silenced doubt. The memory of the plague's horror was too fresh, and in a world that had seen corpses stacked in streets and families wiped out overnight, even brutal justice felt like safety. But the most chilling part, many punishments weren't carried out by officials. They were done by the people themselves. Communal justice, mob justice, became disturbingly common. Villagers formed groups to purge sinners or defend God's peace. Sometimes they burned suspected criminals alive without trial, chanting hymns as they did it. This wasn't mindless cruelty. It was survival psychology. They believed every act of punishment might earn them mercy in the next outbreak. One eyewitness from Bohemia wrote, "They burned the thief not for what he stole, but for the sickness he might bring." Imagine living in that world where anyone could become a criminal overnight, where justice was dictated by fear, and where mercy was seen as weakness. Yet even in that darkness, something remarkable was brewing, something almost paradoxical. The same fear that birthed cruelty also planted the seeds of reform. The horror of plague-era punishments led thinkers to ask, what is justice, if not vengeance? What separates us from the beasts we claim to be better than? Out of that question, centuries later, would come revolutions, rights, and laws based on fairness rather than terror. But that was a long way off, because before enlightenment could rise, the nightmare had to reach its peak. And in the closing years of the medieval world, that nightmare would take its final, most terrifying form, when justice itself became a weapon of faith, the kind of faith that burned entire villages, and all in the name of saving their souls. By the dawn of the 15th century, Europe was no longer the same world that had existed before the plague. Entire generations had vanished. Whole villages lay abandoned, swallowed by the earth or the forest. But something else had taken their place, an obsession, a desperate hunger to make sense of what had happened. And that obsession turned the idea of justice into something far more terrifying. When the plague ended, people didn't find peace. They found ghosts. The guilt of survival haunted them. Why had some lived while others better, holier, kinder had died screaming? The priests said it was sin. The rulers said it was rebellion. And so the search for the guilty never stopped. Punishment became penance. Entire cities built gallows at their gates as symbols of purity. Town squares turned into theaters of pain where every broken body was meant to remind people that the world still had order, that someone, somewhere, was still in control. The lines between crime, sin, and disease blurred completely. If you were poor, you were suspected. If you were a stranger, you were accused. And if you were unlucky enough to cough, limp, or even whisper a prayer that sounded unfamiliar, you could be condemned. The church began taking a stronger hand. Confession was no longer about forgiveness. It was about information. Who had you seen consorting with? Who spread the rumors? Who brewed strange potions? The Inquisition had found its new fuel. Plague paranoia. Records from France and the Holy Roman Empire describe entire networks of spies and informants. Neighbors turned on each other. Families denounced their own members. And once accused, innocence was almost impossible to prove, because medieval courts had discovered something dangerously effective. Fear worked better than truth. They began combining physical torture with public shame, believing that both body and soul needed purification. One of the most horrific punishments was called the burning chair. The condemned would be tied to an iron seat heated over flames until their flesh fused with the metal. The crowd would watch in silence, and priests would declare, "As the body burns, so too is the sin cleansed." Another was the wheel, a punishment reserved for thieves, deserters, and blasphemers. The criminal was bound to a wagon wheel, bones shattered one by one with an iron cudgel. Then the broken body was left suspended in the air, a warning to all who passed. But not all the terror came from official hands. During outbreaks of plague that returned in smaller waves, 1361, 1374, 1400, panic always followed. People remembered the old fears, the old punishments, and revived them with even greater cruelty. That's when one of the darkest trends in history began to take shape. Witch hunts. It started quietly. A few accusations here and there, herbalists, midwives, widows living alone, people who didn't quite fit the mold. But by the late 14th century, entire regions were gripped by hysteria. In Germany and France, rumors spread that witches had caused the plague, that they had poisoned wells, cursed crops, or summoned spirits of disease. The idea of criminals of God took hold. And if you were accused, your fate was sealed. Trials became performances. The accused were paraded through the streets, heads shaved, bodies marked with ashes. They were forced to confess under torture, confess to things no one could possibly have done. And here's the sickest irony. Many confessed, simply to end the pain. Some even believed it, that they must have been cursed, that somehow they had caused the suffering around them. One account from 1397 describes an old woman named Katharina, accused of calling down the black wind. Under torture, she screamed that she had met the devil in the woods and poisoned the river. Her confession was celebrated as proof of victory over evil. She was burned alive the next morning. But perhaps the most tragic part was that people believed this was justice, that in killing the few, they were saving the many. The public didn't just watch, they participated. They sang hymns, threw stones, shouted prayers. They believed each death might buy them one more day without the plague. Imagine living in that time, standing in a square filled with smoke and screams, watching someone burn and thinking, this is safety, this is justice. The irony is chilling, but history, as cruel as it can be, always leaves traces of humanity, even in its darkest chapters. There were those who began to doubt. Scholars who wrote secretly that perhaps God's punishment was not the plague itself, but what men did because of it. In Florence, a young thinker named Giovanni Boccaccio wrote The Decameron, describing how people abandoned reason and mercy. He didn't glorify the punishments, he exposed them. He showed that the true corruption wasn't in the criminals or the sick, it was in the fear that made monsters out of ordinary men. And as centuries passed, those seeds of doubt began to grow. By the late 15th century, Europe began questioning whether justice based on terror could ever lead to peace. Some judges refused to use torture. Some cities banned public executions, believing they encouraged more violence than they prevented. The plague had taught a grim lesson. When fear rules, cruelty follows. Still, it would take hundreds of years before true reform came, before humanity learned that justice should heal, not destroy. But in the medieval world, during those long, desperate plague years, the line between law and horror didn't just blur, it disappeared completely. Because when survival becomes the only goal, morality becomes negotiable. And so, criminals, the sick, and the innocent alike all suffered under the same merciless banner. Order through pain. Their screams built the foundations of modern justice systems that, for all their flaws, were born out of the realization that we could never go back to that. So the next time you read about the Dark Ages, remember, it wasn't just the disease that made it dark. It was what people did to each other in the name of control, faith, and fear. And maybe that's the most haunting legacy of all. Because when fear grips a society, even the most civilized can become the most brutal. And that's what happened to criminals during the plague years. The punishment wasn't just in the pain. It was in the loss of humanity itself.